It's been a while since I released a video, so I thought I would share one of my recent pickups. Hopefully it's of interest to you. It's quite a special watch, especially if you're in the area of collecting Amiga Speedmasters, maybe the Reduced model, of which there's quite a few interesting variants. One of my last few videos on the channel was around my regular Amiga Speedmaster Reduced, which I talked about at length for the reasons why I like it, particularly that it gives you that Moonwatch aesthetic at a smaller size. Well, this one has always been on my radar, so I'd like to share my thoughts about the special edition Speedmaster Reduced Panda dial that was released in department stores in Japan, Marui department stores. Maybe talk a little bit about what I like and compare it to the regular Reduced, and also tell you the story of how I came to acquire this watch, because the more time in which you spend collecting watches, you realise the ones which really stick with you are the ones which have a story around the watch, which help you think about maybe not selling it and not passing it on. So a little bit about the basics of the Speedmaster Reduced. As we talked about in the last video, they're automatic, they're 39mm, and therefore they are quite suited to smaller or average wristed people. They're quite popular in Japan due to the smaller frames over there. So as you can see, we're going to use this Reduced here for comparison later, and that's how the watch sits on my 16cm wrist. And back to the more interesting version. So they've got 39mm diameter, only 44mm lug to lug, 80mm between the lugs. Here we can see this special bracelet we'll talk about. So it's very much like a Datejust 36mm size. So what's special about this one? Well, of course, it's the dial. It's all about the dial, and a few other things which I'll call out. But as I said, these watches were released only through the Marui department stores in Japan, and there's a few versions. There was one original, let's say this is the Panda version, the 3510.21, and that was released on the same bracelet as the regular Reduced, the one which I talked about before. Looks a little bit like President style bracelet, and that one had the same colour scheme as this one. It had regular markers. This one's slightly different. This one was released much later, I think 2007, 2008-ish, had a pretty small run. Because it came out later, it had a few advantages. It got the latest Amiga 3220 movement, which is quite important and quite useful because when you send it for servicing, there's no issues with older movements and getting it serviced with Amiga. And there's a few other differences we'll get into. As well as the Panda version of these, there was the what's sometimes called the albino, where you get a complete white face and white subdials. I personally prefer this one, which is the more traditional and I would say sought after colour scheme with chronographs, and that's because there's some classic chronographs, starting with probably the Rolex Paul Newman, the Daytona, the 6239, with this colour scheme. In fact, a few people will sort of, if they're not too familiar with watches, they may catch a glimpse of this and think it might be a Daytona if they're not looking properly. This one is different to the albino and the original Panda Reduced due to three key differences. So let's get into those now, and if you're watching the video, maybe you're trying to hunt this one down. So the first difference is in the glass. The glass here is sapphire, whereas the original Pandas came with hesselite. My regular Reduced has a hesselite crystal, or hesselite glass, and you can see the aesthetic is slightly different. You get a kind of creamy ring around the Hesselite, which some people like, but also there's a marked difference in the profile. If you look at the profile there, on the Hesselite, if you feel it, it's much more rounded. As I said in my previous video, it's a much more vintage, neo-vintage aesthetic. And it feels softer when you feel plastic, it feels different. Whereas with sapphire, it's obviously more resistant to scratches, but it's flatter, and it's glass, so it's different. The way in which the light interacts is different. So it depends. If you're happy with the sapphire aesthetic, there's definitely durability benefits there. The second difference, and this is where this model starts to become unique in the family here, which is these markers. These markers every 5 minutes, they're actually applied. So I think they're white gold. So they add a bit of interest and texture to the dial, whereas you see on the regular reduced, they're just painted on. And in the original version of this Panda, they were just painted on in black. It's interesting to note that you still get the Arabic numerals, like 5, 10, 20, 25, every 5 minutes on this one. Whereas in the second version of the regular reduced, they dropped those to some people's delight, because this does create for a busy dial, as I talked about in my previous video. But I don't think that detracts too much from the overall aesthetic on the wrist, which is very much that racing Panda chronograph, which everyone likes about this model. Probably one of the reasons why this model is desirable, of course, as humans tend to like things that are scarce. And whilst it's quite hard to find exact numbers, the original Pandas, which had a much longer run, were released in a batch of 2000. I don't think anyone really knows how much these, the 3539.31 version, how many of these they were released. I mean, you can certainly get them. Most of them come out of Japan now, so you're taking a bit of a risk when you buy them. There's about 4 or 5 on Chrono 24 at the moment. And the third area is the bracelet. I'll come on and talk about that in a second. But let me just talk a bit about the story of how I acquired this, now that I mentioned Japan. So I've been after this watch for a while. You keep your eye on the market, but when you're buying in the UK, you have limited options with our import tax structure. So I was always looking at upwards of £7,000 or so to get one of these in good condition with papers. And papers on this watch is incredibly important, because you need a card, which shows the model number and the serial number, and the supplying dealer. The supplying dealer has to show as a Marui department store. Otherwise, of course, you've got a fugazi. So I actually travelled to Japan with my family recently on a 3-week trip, which culminated in Tokyo. And I was browsing the famous Nakano Broadway watch buying area of Tokyo. And this was one of the watches that jumped out at me straight away. And I got talking to the dealer, and the price was decent. He hadn't had it very long. He got the papers. And the thing that really sealed it for me was this watch was sold out of an area dealer, which me and my family spent some time in, shopping and eating food. So it was serendipitous in my eyes that I was going to buy this watch, because now there's a story around it. My daughter was there when I bought it, trying it on. There's great sort of rapport with the seller. So shout out to Renzu if you're ever in that area. So there's a story there now for me with this watch. Not only is it sort of limited edition run, quite hard to come by, but I got it at a good price just down the road from where it was originally sold. So let's talk about that bracelet, because this bracelet adds to the uniqueness of the watch. So as I've mentioned in this video and talked about before, the bracelet on the regular reduced is something which is actually really nice. It's supple, fits really well, no issues sizing on smaller wrists, and you have the micro adjust. And the first version of the reduced Panda came with that bracelet. But for whatever reason, they decided to do something different here, and they spent significant effort doing so, because they've made a bracelet for this watch, as I said, of an unknown quantity, probably less than 1,000 released. And this bracelet is unique to this model, not used on any other watch, any other Speedmaster, not before, not since. And it's not like it's just a slight difference to the regular bracelet. It's completely different bracelet. It's got a different profile. Look, it's as you see, it's much thinner, and it's just interesting. I mean, it's what they've done is they've polished the outer links, which is very common, but rather than brush the inner links, you have this texture of ribbed steel, which from a distance looks brushed, but when you come up close, you see it's actually the same steel material, but it's ribbed. It's actually very nice to see in real life, and actually it's quite nice just to when you sit there sort of playing with your watch. It's got a nice texture. And as you can see, this particular bracelet is in very good condition. There's no sag there in the bracelet. It's quite easy to size. Now, a couple of complaints about the bracelet. It's not all good news. One of the negatives is of this rather interesting contraption they've made here. So when you put it on your wrist, of course, if you're able to expand it further, it makes it easier getting it over your hand. And the way in which they've accomplished this is by having this sort of built-in expansion on the clasp. But it does make it a bit perhaps fragile. But when you go to close the watch, this has to be fully locked in, and then it's got a simple click mechanism. That isn't always super easy to do when it's on your wrist. And then it's only held in place by one push. I would have liked to see two push for resilience. So, I mean, even though I've never caught it, you could in theory catch that and your watch would pop open. Like I say, never done it, but doesn't fill you full of confidence as much as a triple lock Rolex bracelet. Another negative is that, well, you have no micro adjust at all. You can't even get a toothpick out, like you can with this one, with those holes. If you want to resize the watch, you have to add or remove links, and the links are pins, so you're not going to want to be doing that very much. So the approach I've taken on this bracelet is to size large, so it works for me in hot environments, and then it's a bit looser in cold environments. Don't really like doing that with my watches because I like to wear them snug above the wrist bone, but it's a necessary evil with this bracelet. So I'll pop it on the wrist and show you what it looks like. Take off the regular one. I'll show you what I mean about the trickiness putting it on here. So it slides very easily over the hand because of that larger gap, but then you have to push it in and keep it held in before you clip it down. So you see I've sized it quite large. Now, one benefit of this design is it's a hidden clasp, right? So if you've ever seen an oyster bracelet on a day date, they're very special. They have a hidden clasp design. This is quite similar. So it's a trade-off, which I'm quite happy with, because you compare it to the bracelet on the regular Reduced, you have that big clasp, like most watches. Whereas on this, when you do the wrist roll, it's all one, almost like jewellery-esque. You see it sort of sags down because of how loose I've got it. But that's how it sits. So you see it's a much more striking colourway. It's very, very much, most people would agree that colourway is more appealing than this colourway. I also find it a bit more legible in terms of reading the time. So when you glance at your watch, okay, that's the time. I talked about how that can be a bit busy on the regular colourway. And yeah, if you're after that Newman-esque panda look at a tenth of the price, maybe even 5% of the price, you know, Newman's going for 60,000, 80,000 these days, from a household name like Omega, then this is one of the top options, because a lot of the newer Panda speedy options, especially in the smaller sizes, have completely sort of lost their way with design. So what else can we talk about? Well, maybe I'll just give you a quick comparison side by side to close this video out. So we'll look there from the front. And both of these watches are actually in very good condition. This one is from about the year 2000. This is from 2007. Maybe I'll start there. Click the pushers there to get a bit more interesting action happening for the video. It's interesting, some people with chronographs leave their chronograph running all the time to simulate a run in seconds. I'm always worried about the battery depleting overnight, but it certainly makes your watch a bit more dynamic on the wrist. You see there the difference in the bracelets, like even feeling it in hand. On the left hand side here, you see the thickness difference in the bracelet. This one's chunkier. This one's more thinner, more definitely feels more fragile. It's more special, of course, because it's a bit more unique. Down the side there, side profile shot. Exactly the same case profile. You have that stepped out bezel. You have the offset nature of the chronograph and the regular crown, which some people are a little bit put off by. This older watch, if you listen to the jangle of the bracelet, is a little bit more pronounced than the newer one. I'd say this is a more modern fit, but a lot of people like the jangle on the bracelet. Anyway, I'm starting to waffle now. I've covered all the points that I wanted to. I hope you found that interesting. If you were looking for this particular model, I wish you happy hunting. If you need any advice about finding this model, I did a lot of research, and if you particularly want to buy it in Japan, I'm happy to help you. Just ask questions in the comment section below, and I'll give you now 30 seconds of uninterrupted comparison here. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.